Hey guys, and welcome to another video in the series Chronicles of the Wards. So my first video in Chronicles of the Wards was on the more light-hearted side of things. It was a little bit awkward, but mostly funny. However, today's story is on the other side of the spectrum and is not so much a story, rather it's a collection of memories I have from my time as a patient in the hospital. So just for a little bit of context here, this experience kind of ran through my whole 7-year journey being an inpatient across many different wards of the hospital, mostly focusing on the eating disorder ward, where I spent probably 90 to 95% of my time during my hospital admissions. However, these particular memories stem mostly from the period between 2018 and 2021, when I was on a compulsory treatment order. And that's not to say that the treatment order meant that I received different kinds of treatment than I did before, because essentially it's following the same plan. But during that period, instead of being sent directly to the eating disorder ward, I was commonly spending a lot of time on general medical wards or short stay wards prior to being moved to to the eating disorder ward. So by the time I got to the eating disorder ward, I was already drained and fed up with being in hospital. So this chronicle is really about how I managed to feel my emotions in a state of such vulnerability and in a place where I felt really unsafe to do so. So the first biggest difference about this period of time was that when I was on a treatment order, I would have to be what's called specialed. So unless it was on the eating disorder ward, I had a nurse sitting with me 24/7. Now, obviously speaking, being on a treatment order, I was not willing to engage in treatment voluntarily. I didn't want to be at the hospital, I didn't want their help, and I was not in a space of recovery. So to me, the whole process seemed very pointless, especially given the frequency that I was now being admitted to hospital. It was kind of felt like I was being put in the same situation over and over again. They were trying to assist me in the exact same way, but expected a different result, which is literally one of the definitions of being crazy. So it felt like whilst they were calling me the crazy one, they were actually the crazy ones. Anyway, as you can imagine, being there against my will and not seeing any merit to being there piled on to the already stressful environment that it was. And I was having a really difficult time managing my emotions and being able to process through the events as they were happening, because it seemed like every single day there was something that would make me feel so overwhelmed or so frustrated. And all I could do was sit there and deal with it. Now, the other thing about being on any ward in the hospital is that whilst you're a patient, nurses are constantly taking notes on you, as are doctors, as are any specialists who come to see you. But this is particularly noticeable when you experience any kind of emotion and show the slightest expression of that emotion, whether that be physically, like crying, or in your facial expressions, or just verbally when you're trying to explain why you don't agree with something, or when you're trying to get your point of view across and there's someone sitting right there in the room with you scribbling down everything you're saying or everything that you were expressing in that moment. And because I basically had a one-on-one scribe with me the entire time I was on any other medical ward besides the eating disorder ward, it made me really hyper-focused about how I was presenting myself emotionally. I never wanted to give too much of a tell of how distressed I was. But at the same time, it got to a point where I was so overwhelmed that I could not help but to break down at certain moments. And it was very confronting to have someone sit there and just scribble it all down on the paper. So what I did when I was on other wards besides the eating disorder ward was, if I could manage my emotions, great, I'd hold on to them as much as I can, and I would try to let things just pass over my head. When I felt like I needed to vent or cry or anything like that, I would try to wait for certain periods of time. So the thing about special nurses is, although they're meant to observe you 24/7, as soon as the night nurse comes on, they are generally asleep for the whole shift, which meant that I would often spend my time crying during that so no one could see. Otherwise, if it was just during the day, I would pretend that I was gonna have a nap, that I was a little bit tired, and I'd turn and I'd roll over in my bed to face the opposite side of wherever they were sitting. And lucky for me, I'm a very silent crier unless like I get too worked up or whatever. But if I just need to like release a few tears or whatever, I'm able to keep it really quiet. So they would just assume that I'm sleeping and I would just be on my side crying basically. So this became harder to conceal the more I was in and out of the hospital system and in and out of admissions, and that frustration just bubbled up to new levels and I really did not know how to contain it. So when I was trying to process through my emotions later on, I stopped caring as much if they knew that I was upset. What started to bother me though was that there was someone sitting there just watching me cry, and I couldn't handle someone just sitting there and looking at me while I was crying. Like, it's a very personal thing when you cry, and it's hard enough to do it in front of someone you love or someone you know, but to do it in front of this stranger who's sitting there and, you know, from the purity of their heart, trying to comfort you by saying, you know, they're just doing what's best for you, but actually has no idea of the background situation. It's both frustrating and embarrassing and just not comfortable at all. So what I would do later on when I was at that extreme point is I would just sit up in my bed, turn around, face the wall, cry if I need to, but at least I know the person or the people who are looking at me are behind me. I can't see them look at me. I've got a little bubble of somewhat privacy. Otherwise, I would just tuck my head under the sheets a little bit so I wasn't aware of my surroundings. But essentially, I would just do what I could to escape that environment without actually physically being allowed to leave my bed. Now, things were somewhat better, or at least different, when I got to the eating disorder ward. So when I was on the eating disorder ward, I would be in what's called the front room, which is a single room facing the nurses' station. So if I have my door open, which I did all the time, the nurses would be able to look in on me whenever they were in the nurses' station, and I would be able to see them. Now, the proximity was a lot better, so it didn't feel like someone was right in my space when I was like emotional. However, there were times where it also did get really overwhelming and I couldn't contain how emotional I was. And during those times, I had a few strategies of how I would process the emotions then as well. However, there were still times where I felt like I needed more space than I was getting. So even though I had my own room and no one was physically in that room with me, knowing they could see me was very distressing and uncomfortable. So generally, if I was able to, I would save my tears for, again, nighttime. They did like hourly checks, but as I said, I'm a silent crier anyway, and it's dark. They only bring a little torch, so it's not like they were shining a light to see if I was okay or not. I would also save it for shower time, which is different on a general medical ward or anywhere else I would have been in the hospital, because when you're on any other ward but the eating disorder ward, for eating disorder patients, they will have the special watch you in the shower. So I had someone looking at me while I was bathing. However, on the eating disorder ward, it's a little bit different. They have at least a curtain that you're allowed to draw. So during that time, I would often cry, or if I wanted to cry privately, that's when I'd do it. Also, we had a little balcony that we were allowed to use when the weather was between certain temperatures. So if no one else was on the balcony and I was able to find a spot in the corner facing out the window, which meant that my back was to the nurses' station and the rest of the ward, I would sometimes cry then and just hope no one walks in, and if they do walk in, like quickly try to compose myself. But in a similar way to when I was on the other wards, sometimes I just got so overwhelmed that I was like, I do not care. If they see me break down, too bad. All I want right now is a little bit of privacy to be able to do that. So when I felt like really strong emotions and I knew I couldn't contain it anymore, and I mean, it was still at the forefront of my mind that people were watching, but it was less important, I guess, in those moments. I would try to create as much privacy as I could, and one of the things I would do is I would sit on the floor behind my bed and cry. Now, it meant that the nurses couldn't see me from their station, but most of the time they were okay as long as they peeked their head through the door, saw I wasn't like doing anything dangerous or anything. Most of them would give me the grace to just leave me alone for at least an hour before they came back to be like, are you okay? Otherwise, when it got really, really bad, I would elevate the top half of my bed. So we all kind of know hospital beds can go up and down that way. So you're lower or higher off the ground, but they also go up and down. So you're sitting up or you're laying flat. And I would sit it all the way up. So the bed was kind of in an L shape. And I would take my pillow and I would put it in the bed frame behind the front end of the bed. So if you can imagine, when the bed's in an L shape, a lot of the frame of the bed is exposed behind the mattress. And I would just create a little nook in that area. I'd put my pillow down. I'd sit in the middle of the bed frame and just like cry or just sit there and try to process what was happening. And a lot of the time, this was following really sad or disheartening events. So if I had a particularly bad ward round, or if I had a tribunal hearing that did not go my way, which was very often during this period, because I would do a tribunal hearing, get rejected to come off the treatment order, and it's straight away, like the next day or the day after, depending on how long I needed to recover from that failure, I would reapply again. So I was having so many constant tribunal hearings, and all of them were a no, you need to stay in hospital. No, we're not taking you off the treatment order. And it was devastation after devastation. And I just needed a little area, a little time for myself to really process through that without piercing eyes. And look, the nurses were respectful and they were graceful. It's not like they were all up in my space, but there were times where it was a little bit too intrusive. They would come and ask like how I'm doing, good-natured, of course, but what I needed was space. What I wanted was to leave. I didn't want these people around me during the most deflating period of time, because essentially, although they did not extend my order or disapprove of me coming off the order, they are the ones who put it in place in the first place. Like, they are the ones who put me on the order. They are the ones keeping me on the order. And so to have that same team come up to you and ask if you're okay when you've just failed your tribunal hearing, or after they've told you you're not allowed to have leave or be discharged during a ward round, it's like, no, I'm not okay. And also, no, I don't want to talk to you right now. Like, please give me some space, sort of thing. And again, some of the nurses were good about letting patients use the visitor room, which meant that the room that was used for when you have your visitors later on in the afternoon could be made available to anyone who was in quite a emotional, fragile state. And there was a lot of use of that room around ward rounds, because everyone was basically getting upsetting news, and you were kind of lucky if you got some really good news. But even that I kind of didn't love, because they would check on me a lot more often. And when they open the door, it's also parallel to the lounge area where all the other patients are. And it's hard enough to contain my emotions, but I know it's also distressing to witness someone who is constantly so emotional. So although I was aware I was having really big reactions and that would impact the other patients on the ward, it wasn't enough that I could contain myself. It wasn't enough that I could say, like, don't cry right now, don't break down right now, because it's going to have an impact on everyone. It was kind of just like, I've been doing this for too long. I need to be able to vent now. So even when I used some of these tactics or strategies to find a grain of privacy during such emotional turmoil, there were still times where I was not able to fully process through what had triggered me in the first place, because even though I get moments of privacy that I create, like I mentioned when I was crying on the floor or in the bed frame, a lot of nurses were good about giving me a bit of time to just calm down, but it never fully healed. I didn't get the time to heal completely, and by the time I was making progress towards healing, something else would happen, and all of it really piled up. And by the end of it, I was having moments where I was like, I'm not even sure how I'm existing right now. And I don't mean that in a self-harm manner. I just mean like, I am so overwhelmed. I'm not sure how I am still in this world. Like, I don't know how I'm going on, sort of thing. And it was just an awful period of time. In the same breath, I can understand being a patient in hospital means that all the professionals in there have a duty of care, which is why they couldn't give me the amount of privacy or the amount of time I needed to deal with things as they came up. But at the same time, I think the takeaway here is really, there are so many things that need to improve in the system and in the way that compulsory treatment orders are given to eating disorder patients. And I just think there's a lot that can be taken from this one particular element of being in hospital as an eating disorder patient that could really be used to transform the way we do things going forward. So I'm really sorry this is not as chirpy as the first one of the stories I gave, but I hope it's shed some light on a really important topic. And for people who can resonate, I'm so sorry you were in that situation or are in that situation. And I would just encourage you to do anything that can relieve stress in the healthiest way possible and in the most efficient way possible given your circumstances, and just stay positive and know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And a lot of those feelings I was experiencing were temporary in those few years, and now that I'm out of it and in a better place, it's something I don't even have to worry about, and I doubt will ever come up again in my life to that extreme. So thanks for watching, guys, and have a great day. Bye.